Good evening, everyone. We'll do that one more time. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. There we go. For those of you whom I've not had the opportunity to meet, I am Horace Mitchell, and it has been my privilege and honor to serve our community as president of California State University, Bakersfield over the last 13 years. Thank you. Thank you. I want to extend to each of you a personal welcome, as well as a welcome on behalf of our distinguished faculty and staff, especially the faculty and staff of the Kegley Institute of Ethics. Let's give them all a big hand. As many of you know, this is the 32nd annual Charles W. Kegley Memorial Lecture. And we have a very distinguished speaker with us this evening, to whom I'll extend a special welcome now again, but he will be introduced shortly, and that is Dean and Professor Wasserman from the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. Welcome. It seems like retiring is becoming the mode at the moment. I say that because I announced last month that I will be retiring at the end of this year. And as you know, Chris Myers, who's been the executive director of the Kegley Institute of Ethics for quite some years, has announced he's retiring as well, and in fact, when he comes up, he's going to have a special introduction. So at this point, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Chris Myers.
Dr. Mitchell's so anxious to get out of here. He's thinking about his home on the beach as he's... Welcome, folks. It's terrific to be doing this again tonight. And before we get into the festivities, I would like to introduce the new director of the Kegley Institute of Ethics. Michael, come on up. This is Dr. Michael Burrows. Michael comes to us from Penn State's Rock Center for Ethics, where he was their associate director, and among a wide array of specializations and interests, he's particularly interested in ethics education, especially in K through 12 education, and that will become a major new focus for the center. He rose to the top of an international pool of extraordinarily impressive candidates. We were blown away by the interest in the position, and he's already doing a great job. It's a powerful reminder of this job's for the young. I get tired just watching him going to meetings. So he's bringing that energy, he's bringing his ideas, and I'm thrilled leaving it in awesome hands. So please join me in welcoming Michael Burrows.
First of all, hello and good evening. Thanks to Christopher and President Mitchell as well. I guess I just want to say a couple things. I don't want to take time away from Dr. Wasserman and his lecture, which is certainly the main event tonight. The first thing is just to say thank you. I drove cross country this summer to get here, and it's always a big transition when you're moving to a new place, wherever it is, but particularly cross country. But I've gotten just an extremely welcoming reception, both from Provost Zorn, President Mitchell, Christopher, Nate, faculty and students, that it's made the transition actually really wonderful and exciting for me. And the second part too is any job that I've worked in, I think the most important aspect of being successful is meeting people who are excited to collaborate and, to put it simply, want to do stuff, want to build things and do interesting projects that benefit our community and our campus. And I've already met lots of people who want to do that work with me. And I'm really about building that community and doing that work together and taking our institutes to the next level. and our campus and community to the next level. So thanks very much for your support thus far and for your help going forward as I'm still learning and growing into the position. It's wonderful to see you all tonight. Thanks for coming out.
So I've been doing this for about 30 years now and have a lot of people to thank. I'm taking my cue from the academic awards. So my kindergarten teacher, I'm glad they got a few laughs. I do want to wish Shana Tova to those in the audience for who are celebrating New Year's and the start of the High Holy season. Thank you for coming on such a special night. And I'm not going to do the individual thank yous tonight. I will do those privately. But of course, we do need to thank the folks who make evenings like this possible. And we've got terrific sponsors, a growing list of sponsors, which I think speaks exactly to our excitement and energy around Dr. Burrows' hire. Tonight, please join me in giving special thanks to TBC Media, represented tonight by Bob Price, Chevron, represented by Adam Alvidrez, Kern Schools Federal Credit Union, represented by Steve Vernock, and a partnership between Kaiser Permanente and Adventist Health Bakersfield, here represented by our birthday boy, Mr. David Womack. Please join me in thanking them very much. And I'm sure David's going to quit the Institute board if I keep mentioning his birthday. And of course, I need to thank Jackie and the Kegley family. She and I have been collaborators in this for many years, and any successes we have are due to her and her family and the terrific support they've given. So tonight's topic is, to my mind, one of the most important we've covered, maybe even the most important we've covered in our 30 years of doing this, and with nothing less than our ability to be self-governing members of a democratic society potentially at stake. In fact, until just very recently, when we talked about fake news, what we were talking about was mermaid sightings or Elvis sightings or the latest alien human love child, the headlines of your supermarket tabloids. And those were all great fun. In the last few years, discussions of fake news have taken a very different kind of turn. It's now about things like Hillary Clinton setting up a sex ring in the basement of a Washington, D.C. area pizza parlor, or the Pope endorsing in an unprecedented way President Trump during the campaign, both of which obviously turned out to be false. In the latter case, in the case of the Pope, it at most created some confusion, and really, that seems odd. And then people were quickly able to figure out that something had gone screwy in the information. In the Comet Pizza case, was much more, actually in the end, horrifying. If you'll recall, the story seemed to have convinced a guy named Edgar Welch to drive hundreds of miles armed with an assault-style rifle. And he invaded the pizza store, held the customers and the employees at bay with the goal of rescuing these poor children that he actually believed were being held in the basement and sexually abused. Fortunately, nobody was shot, but that was as much by pure luck and wonderful law enforcement response as anything else. I assume, in fact, I hope I assume, that everyone here can chuckle about the mermaid headlines, seeing through them for what they are, mere entertainment to sell papers. For the more serious And given the exponential growth in what are now often ideological information sources, it has gotten much harder to distinguish the valid from the con. The purveyors of false information have gotten really good at mimicking legacy sources, at mimicking sources that you have come to rely on, or they're really good at mixing fake news side by side with good, accurate, truthful, trustworthy news. In my mind, it's really dang scary stuff, which is why I'm just super thrilled that we have Ed Wasserman with us tonight to help us make sense of it all. As the Dean of Cal's School of Journalism, if you follow rankings, and depending on whose source you're looking at, they're either number 1, 2, or 3 of the best journalism schools in the country. For tonight, of course, they're number 1. The people they're putting out are just, among the best of the best, and the people they have working there are among the best of the best. And then they hired this guy, the best of the best of the best, to help guide them, to help them make sense out of what good journalism is, and I think just as importantly, to teach all of us how to be good media literate consumers. He's spent a career as a practicing journalist, as an educator, as a scholar. He's had academic and working stints all across the country. He's widely published, and somehow finds the time to do a semi-regular blog or column posting on contemporary issues in journalism ethics and journalism philosophy. He's also an old friend, but he's as smart as folks come on this stuff. And he pisses me off on a regular basis because it happened today. We're talking about these really interesting, important ideas, and I'm kind of running them around in my head. And then he says something that's just so much smarter, so much more eloquent, so much more brilliant than anything I could ever come up with. And then he publishes that. In the process, making all the rest of us, Ed, look like buffoons. So for that and a gazillion other reasons, it's really a treat. Join me in welcoming Dr. Ed Wasserman.
Wow. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you for the honor of being here. Let me just make sure I have all of my toys. I'm a little bit of a novice when it comes to PowerPoint. I use it in my classes, but I'm trying to kind of make it really work tonight for you guys because it's a real honor to be here. Christopher, when I went and made a sharp right turn into academia in 2003 after 25 or 28 years as a journalist, there were a very small number of people I could call on for mentoring because I was learning ethics. I had been a business and financial journalist and I ran a chain of papers and spent a lot of time ignoring ethics. So it became, suddenly I was supposed to be preaching ethics. So I had to forget who I'd been before I became a virgin. And Christopher was one of the very small number of people I could reliably call on for very, very smart advice and never made me feel stupid for asking. And that's the mark of a great teacher. So, Christopher, I'm sorry you're leaving this job. I know you're not sorry, but and there's a sort of a twinge of envy. But there you are. Thank you. I have to confess, it's a little unnerving for me to get out of Berkeley, come down here. Berkeley is a nuclear-free zone. So when I leave, I kind of feel exposed. And I want you to sympathize. Now, it's a comfort to me to know that Bakersfield is an oil and gas town, so I feel some sense of relief. Who are you exactly? Let me just, that's not a trivial question, but how many of you are students? Okay, and undergraduates mainly? Undergraduates? Okay, any of you think you want to be journalists? Ooh, wow. Well, what are the rest of the people here? Who are they going to learn about the world from if the four of you are going to take care of it for them? That's terrific. I'm so reassured. So I guess I'm comforted. So, and the rest of you are here out of interest. Now, I have to confess, you will notice a little bit of a bait and switch here. The topic on that brochure with that older but distinguished-looking guy's picture on there, that's a different topic from the one I'm actually prepared to talk about. But we'll get to the threat to democracy. But Christopher, having assigned me the topic, then kept pestering me for an actual title. And finally, he sent me something, yeah, that'll be fine. It will be about fake news. Threat to democracy, we can get to that in the Q&A, maybe. Anyway, we gather at a troubled time for those of us who care about journalism and who believe a lot is riding on its ability to weather the current period of difficulty, menace, mortal threat. It's certainly no comfort to learn. A couple of weeks ago, there's a lawyer named Floyd Abrams, maybe familiar with the name to anybody? You heard of Floyd Abrams, no? He's probably the premier First Amendment litigator in the country. He was lead counsel on the Pentagon Papers, defending the New York Times. Unfortunately, lately, he was lead counsel on the Citizens United case, backing the ability of corporations to lay claim to the First Amendment. Not so cool. But he was telling me that this is a time of jubilation among the people, the plaintiffs' First Amendment bar. Those are the people who sue news organizations. And they're having a very good time of it because juries really hate the media. Now, fortunately, the way the jurisprudence has come down, typically you win at trial, or rather you lose if you're defending the media in defamation case, you lose at trial, but then you win on appeal. But then now we have the instance involving the redoubtable Hulk Hogan, not his real name, and the sex tapes that Gawker had run, showing him making love with his best friend's wife, and it was all very squalid. But what happened that matters is that the lawsuit that Hogan filed, which, as you probably know, was bankrolled by Peter Thiel, the Silicon Valley billionaire who was angry at Gawker, supposedly because Gawker had outed him and Peter Thiel was gay. And so he sought revenge against Gawker by bankrolling this otherwise kind of sketchy lawsuit in which this videotape by Hulk Hogan, the sex, Gawker ran it, and so he enabled Hogan to win the case, and for various reasons that are explained in a terrific movie called Nobody Speak. It's a documentary. You should get it on Netflix. It'll explain the whole case in ways much better than I am. But bottom line is that Hogan won, and they had jerry-rigged the litigation in such a way that Gawker's insurance wouldn't cover the appeal. So they won. The jury threw the book at it. It was a $100 million bond they had to post, so Gawker went out of business. First time I know of a defamation suit leading to the destruction of a news organization. So we have that. Now we have John Oliver, HBO, being sued by a coal baron for things that he said about him on the air. And listen, facing a deep pocket plaintiff, even if you're a deep pocket defendant, is no fun. In any event, my hope tonight is to set this current assault on the media into a larger context and offer some avenues to reform. The first part is easier than the second because the problems seem pretty deep and intractable, but we'll give it a shot anyway. The main points of tonight's talk: first, I want to talk about the era of digital populism, which is what I call the current regime. And there exists a crisis of authority involving the media, which is to say that nobody believes the media speak with any. And in that respect, what I'm suggesting is fake news is emblematic of this larger crisis of authority in the media sphere. And that means, as I say in Silicon Valley, fake news isn't a bug, it's a feature. Secondly, I'm going to then go on and talk about fake news clamor, strengthened by the fact that news is, and always has been, a construction. It's built out of some pretty problematic practices that really constitute artifice. It doesn't mean news is bogus. It just means that delivering the news isn't the same thing as delivering the truth. So we'll discuss some of the things that's right to be skeptical about when we talk about the news. So in this respect, fake news is, as we say in my line of work, a teachable moment. So that said, things are different now in the digital age. There's more contrivance than ever. It's become harder than ever to distinguish news that's deserving of trust from self-serving, promotional, corrupt flows of information and interpretation. And we'll spend a few minutes looking at why. And then finally, what to do. The news ecosystem has got to respond at the producer level, the platform level, the advertiser level, the consumer level, and the journalist level, how to make sure the sources of news that are doing what we need done are incented and rewarded, and what, if anything, should journalists be doing differently. So we can get into the threat to democracy later on in the conversation, but let's first do this. So the current age, welcome to the era of digital populism. It's once upon a time when we in the media world imagined a utopia. It featured universal access to information sources and the means of distributing it widely with cheap devices. Now, indeed, each of us, thanks to our iPhones, each of us has better access to information than the best-sourced reporter did a generation ago. Each of us can reach larger audiences than the best-watched news program or the widest circulating newspaper in the world did a generation ago. So I guess we've arrived. It's utopia, except for one thing, actually, except for a few things, big things. Most importantly, with all this sunny democratization and empowerment has come an ever more aggressive propagation of falsity. More people believe more things that aren't so than ever. At least, maybe that's just my belief. I don't have the facts. I don't know how you compare how many people believe the stupid things they believe now a generation ago, but it seems to me a pretty fair bet that more. And at the same time, we have this deepening harm to our political culture, which is being fragmented and refragmented into population slivers that subscribe to incompatible social cosmologies built on often wholly false truth claims. Why? In its economic fundamentals, the media marketplace no longer recognizes, let alone rewards, factually authoritative accounts. And instead, it thrives on customized informational flows tailored to what marketers believe individuals want to hear. This general skepticism that authoritative accounts are even possible. Wrong generation for X-Files, but the other mantra for X-Files wasn't just trust no one, it was the truth is out there. Now, the collapse of authority is really important. This wasn't a problem in the pre-digital age because informational authority paid off. It wasn't always deserved. The good old days included massive exclusion from what was a more unified but also a much narrower news agenda. But the media made money by being credible. Prestige media, the ones that had reporting staffs that broke news about things that mattered, they could cash in on their standing as authoritative. They benefited either from larger audiences or from higher advertising rates that rewarded them for the demographic desirability of their upscale audiences. Came to them because of the authority with which they spoke. So the market worked to reward quality. They were trusted. True, Media advertising was always a bit of a scam. I did my share of selling ads when I was running a chain of newspapers. Not proud of it. Nobody ever quite knew whether their advertising actually worked. The old lament goes, I know half of the money I spent on advertising is wasted, but I don't know which half. And it wasn't just authority that was rewarded. It was also possible to go down market and assemble big audiences and make money from that too. But I digress. Now, in the digital age, sophisticated measurement and targeting of online media users has created a new world of calibrated journalism and a huge incentive to treat news exclusively as just another consumer good. That means now that you can determine it with surgical precision, you can give customers exactly what they want. And that means a world that confirms their preconceptions. The consequences are profound. Think about it. It goes down to search results. Say you have a person who believes in the literal truth of the book of Genesis, and you have somebody else who's an activist with Greenpeace, presumably an irreligious follower of environmental causes, and they both plug in climate change. And they Google it. Each of them will get dramatically different informational results. Same search term. Why? Because Google's doing you a favor. It's checking you out. It knows what you've looked at before. It knows what your interests consist of, and they want to keep the customer satisfied. You and your buddy end up inhabiting completely different informational realities. They call that serving their needs, anticipating their interests. It's a kind of market-driven response, and I'm calling it digital populism. Now, instead of embracing a duty to make a disinterested appraisal of what the public needs to know, editorial judgment becomes a straightforward matter of giving the public what it wants to hear, as reflected in an appraisal of proven individual interest. So on a macro level, it explains that the same TV news organizations that despised Trump propelled his campaign through disproportionate coverage of it. His celebrity drove his candidacy. He was and remains a riveting television presence. Ratings soared. This was Les Moonves, the head of what was once called the Tiffany Network. Direct quote. What we learned from the electoral outcome is that exposure trumps, you'll forgive the expression, substance. Now, on another, more granular level, the danger is that the entire machinery through which independent, fact-based reporting on matters of broad public significance has been sustained is now being dismantled. The new regime rewards access to audience fragments that have shown interest in particular topics and affection for particular perspectives, and that results in deepening divisions. The system encourages, with click-throughs and advertiser access, the intriguing and the viral, regardless of importance, and to put fake news in context, regardless of veracity. Now that's important. The economic model rewards, not just tolerates, but actually rewards the production and dissemination of fabrications. Along with celebrity news and miscellaneous atrocities, there's little or no marketplace sanction for falsity, cruelty, trivialization, and any material that insults, slanders, or misleads. So fake news is a frontal assault, but I'm going to argue now that it's part of a larger crisis of authority in the news business, which with few exceptions no longer is designed to pay for the kind of journalism that speaks authoritatively and factually, and the kind of journalism upon which our political culture has for 200 and some odd years relied. So, to my second point. I'm getting ahead of myself. News and artifice. Now, I had a number of questions about, well, how new is this? So I'm going to give a little background on falsity in the news. Fake news has obviously become the flavor of the month in media talk. It started out as an applause line for politicians looking for a stick with which to hit back over unfavorable coverage. It repeats and deepens charges of media bias that were first successfully leveled in the late 60s during the Nixon administration by his vice president, Spiro Agnew, using lines written by Patrick Buchanan, an early stage nativist. And then the language was a little bit different. It was media bias. It was the effete, liberal East Coast media promulgating points of view that discredited Americans, that undermined faith and patriotism in the country, this sort of thing. Veracity wasn't the key issue, it was bias. And there we have Nixon and Spiro. Didn't end well for those guys. Nixon was chased from office. Spiro did federal time for bribery. He was taking money in brown paper bags. But still, it caught fire. It's caught fire as a matter of public concern. And I want to ask a different question now, which is why has fake news caught on the way it has? And here's where I think the teachable moment is. And I'm going to reserve fake news to describe fabrications, deliberate fabrications or hoaxes. So let me talk a little about the history of those. There was never a shortage of make-believe stories that were energetically circulated during the 2000s. There was no shortage in 2016 when the term captured the public imagination, but there's never been a scarcity of high-profile media frauds. You had 1980, you had Janet Cook, 1981. She wrote a compelling, tremendously moving story about an 8-year-old heroin addict in Washington, D.C. that turned out to be a complete fabrication. She won a Pulitzer Prize, and then she apologized and said, oops, her editor was Bob Woodward. Then you had Stephen Glass, New Republic, 1998. Again, a fabulist. Made up stories about events that didn't happen, made up people who didn't exist, and they made a movie about him. Then you had the famous Jason Blair, New York Times, 2003. Again, a serial fabricator and plagiarist. And on to our friend Brian Williams, 2014. His sin was that he was misremembering moments of heroism that actually involved other people, but his renditions of them involved him in essentially heroic roles. And now we have a guy, Kevin Deutsch, who's done, oh, he's not on this. I'll get back to that. So he's a crime reporter and a number of papers, for a number of papers in the East Coast, and it's found that his work was layered with fabrications and made up people. This is obviously a very difficult thing for news to control. There's a tremendous culture of trust within the news business. Very few supervisors are in a position to truly vet and control for deliberate fabrication. They try, sometimes, but these things slip through. So it undermines, it has a tremendously damaging effect on the culture of mutual reliance that news organizations rely on. But we can take some comfort in the fact that these great hoaxes I'm talking about, these fabrications and the like, were kind of inconsequential. The stories kind of didn't matter. Jason Blair's stories, you know, they were about, they were advances on stories that were there was the DC sniper story, and he made up some stuff about that. There was the woman from West Virginia who was injured in the early days of the Iraq War, who came back to her hero's welcome in West Virginia, and he purported to have done an interview with her family. It didn't really matter a whole lot. This is not exhaust the field. I mean, there were also stories of major consequence that arose that were attacked for their supposed falsity. The 2004 election, both candidates, George W. Bush and John Kerry, were the subject of coverage that pivoted on factual assertions and were the focus of withering assault for possible fabrication. Kerry was a medal-winning skipper of a small gunship in Vietnam, and the people who opposed his candidacy mounted a tremendously vigorous assault that claimed that he had made up critical parts of his war record. And his opponent, George W. Bush, was the subject of a 60 Minutes report that was anchored by Dan Rather on his National Guard record. Where is Bush? What happened to Bush? There he is. And this is one where the account was criticized on the basis of the supposed fabrication or forgery of a document, one of the documents that was used in compiling it. So we've got, we do have evidence of hoaxes that have real consequence. In this case, Bush got elected and Rather got fired. So we're coming upon this history of avid pursuit of sensational stories that turned out to be utterly bogus. And so here we have the Clintons, who have been a particular target of these. This relates to the Wall Street Journal's editorial page continues to harbor sympathizers who suspect that Hillary and Bill Clinton connived to murder a man named Vince Foster, an old friend and a White House aide, who everybody else, including the police, concluded had committed suicide in a park in D.C. in 1994. This is a kind of composite picture, but the Hillary did it is a real headline in the New York Post. There was, some of you may remember, during the Clinton administration, a story called Deepwater, or a story was called Whitewater. It was a real estate deal that went south in Arkansas. And numerous publications dispatched large numbers of reporters to unearth the facts behind this supposed scandal, a corruption scandal. What's important here is that these stories were rubbish. And these stories were avidly pursued. They had tremendous consequence in discrediting and harming the reputation of the Clintons, right? But they were never proven. So what I'm saying here is that this fake news business has a seriously important and kind of long lineage. And it's not the first time we've seen it, not the first time we've seen news organizations succumb to the lure of stories that turned out not to be true, and by chipping away at those stories, continue to harm the reputation of people who are the subject of those stories. And this is what Trump is complaining about now when he says fake news. He's not saying the individual facts in the stories are wrong. He's saying the overall storyline is misplaced and wrong. So the individual stories that are spun out of that storyline, so-and-so refuses to talk, so-and-so is going to be subpoenaed, it's an incremental advance in the story, but being subpoenaed to discuss something that Trump fundamentally rejects as ever having happened. So I have some sympathy for the idea that you can have a story that is false and ill-founded and nevertheless have valid news reports spun off of that story. And then you look at the news reports and people say, aha, see that? He's going to talk. Aha, he's refusing to talk. Whatever it is that you have when you're discussing and you're reporting on the procedural details of an investigation, if the overall investigation is trying to prove something that you fundamentally say didn't happen, then you can be forgiven for calling the stories fake news. Anyway, but I don't think, where I'm going with this, I don't think the occasional fabrication is why this term has caught on. I think fake news reflects a larger unease with the news we get. Its authenticity, the reason it's shaped the way it is, the people it benefits, and the overall role that it plays in creating a society that we're glad to be part of. So in that respect, I like to think there's a healthy side to this skepticism. If it feeds a greater sophistication among news consumers and a determination to insist on media accountability. Forgive me a second, I'm suddenly parched. In this respect, the fake news clamor could nourish a larger critique of some of the problematic features of news as news has traditionally been practiced, and which actually do warrant disbelief and mistrust, or at least skepticism. And if reforming things means restoring the press to continue doing the things they've always done wrong, let's spend a moment considering what are some of the things about news that we should be uneasy about. First of all, what is news? What's newsworthy? What are the standards of significance? Where do they arise from? Who tells the media what it is that's worth covering? When you answer that question, you find the first thing you find is a mindless, reflexive deference to authority, to officialdom. Why the fuss over who gets admitted to White House press briefings where information is never, ever, ever disclosed anyway? Why is so much journalism top-down? Why is confidentiality used so often to protect people who don't need protection? Why do the media cover a presidential campaign for 18 months where the public's attention is minimal until the final few? I don't know. So much of coverage of national affairs derives from the preconceptions and the concerns of the opinion leaders and the people who run Washington. And I think we should sort of take that out and ask, wait a minute, is that what an independent press is all about? Then there's the way stories are framed. You know, how do you define the story? Once you decide that something going on in the society is important, how do you define it? There's a mental laziness in the press, casting policy disputes as exercises in advancing or retarding the fortunes of the players involved. Once you find, you're asking, who's going to benefit if this particular piece of legislation actually passes? Is this going to mean a victory for McConnell? Is this going to mean a setback for Trump? La-di-da. What's the legislation about? How's it going to affect people? What's it going to do to their lives? Secondary issue. Let's focus on what matters, which is the political play of forces in Washington. You see that all the time. You particularly see it with coverage of foreign news. You don't cover foreign news unless Washington cares about it. The rest of the world exists only as a place where the play of forces within Washington, D.C. can be tested. Then there's the question of what... Wait, did I go too far? Sorry. What is considered adequate from the point of view of evidence? What is considered... How do 3 on-air NPR interviews from a small town in Illinois constitute the view from the heartland? Why was the Trump victory such a surprise? Think about all the reporting that wasn't done to miss the strength of the support for Donald Trump. What are the deals that are being cut to get the story? What's not being told? There's this larger unease about the media as manipulative and self-serving, not the adversarial warriors what news people imagine themselves to be. And some of these concerns derive from the standard practices in the traditional production of news. It's not that news is fake. It's that the claim that news people make, that they're producing accounts of reality that are uniquely fair, balanced, insightful, trustworthy, and therefore merit the cultural and legal privileges our society affords, is hard to sustain. News is a particular form of social knowledge. It's gathered to be sold and sold against for profit as a market commodity. Part of its marketplace appeal, of course, relates to its central role in civic discourse. But commercial pressures have had formative influence on the evolution of this form of social awareness and on its limitations as a truth-telling mechanism. That doesn't make news without enormous value. We need to keep up with changing circumstances. We need to share with others concern with realities that are interesting and at times emblematic. As a social ritual, news rivets and binds us together. But it has its own inbuilt biases. It introduces distortions, and hence my use of the word artifice to describe normal news. It systematically privileges momentary change, not enduring realities. What's new, from a marketing perspective, provides a strong reason to tune back in the evening, to keep an eye on the news. You get repeat customers. But it doesn't necessarily give us the kind of depth of awareness that we need of the continuing realities and continuing problems society has. It looks for aberrations from the norm, not illumination of the norm. It assigns great importance to stories. We tell our students, you're learning to tell stories. What is a story? What is a story? A story has heroes and villains. A story has rising action. A story has drama. Think of this, how carefully you have to select from the elements of reality around you in order to conform with a story form. It's built around beats. What are beats? Beats are designed to cover institutions. It confers tremendous centrality, tremendous importance on the role of institutions in life. We give their news flows a special importance. We assign people to specialize in husbanding and relaying those news forms. We're drawn to pseudo-events, the famous term by Daniel Boorstin. A pseudo-event is something that happens in order to be covered. There's a famous statement from Larry Speaks, the former press secretary for President Reagan, who said to reporters, "You don't tell us how to stage the news, and we won't tell you how to cover it." We have this tradition of objectivity, so-called objectivity, which involves tremendous deference to authority, tremendous deference to officialdom, to get the belief that there is an Olympian perspective on reality that we have to reflect in our coverage. Yes, you may go to the scene of the flooding. You may talk to the people who've lost their homes, been flooded out. You'll get good color, a good opening for your story. But to find out the reality of the story, you've got to find some guy, normally a guy, in an office with a telephone on his desk. That'll give you the objective word on what the flooding is all about. And it's always been calibrated to maximize effectiveness as an ad conduit, audience size and demographics. And the final point I would make about it is now we're talking about a news cycle of increasing velocity and churn. The speed of the news cycle nowadays, and I bring this up because there's the corresponding to this increase in velocity has been the rise of the belief in the self-cleansing internet. The belief that you can put out information that you may not have nailed down as true because you can come back very, very easily and correct it. Harm expunged. Falsehood is gone. Right? So the myth of the self-cleansing, this is of course ridiculous because you can correct things without any assurance that correction will catch up with the error. You can correct things in a way that people may never see the correction. And unfortunately, there's evidence that people who see corrections don't believe corrections. Oh, there's a reason they're saying that. It must have gotten a call from somebody. There's actually experimental evidence to suggest that people believe the error more after they see the correction. I don't make this stuff up. So the idea the internet corrects itself, what do you do when you have a Boston Marathon bombing and you've got identified tentatively, we haven't confirmed this, but we've identified a couple of the people of interest. Remember, those faces went out there. So the pictures of those people went out there, and we're about 5 minutes away from having facial recognition software that would give you the name and address of those people at the same time. How long does it take to gather a lynch mob? So we're talking about some very, very dangerous practices that are now coming into the news business and need to be fought, need to be struggled with. Now, on top of the rest, we have this unprecedented commercial pollution of news type reports via native advertising. I'll come back to in a moment. But the upshot, and it is a kind of a somber appraisal, and I apologize for that, and we'll have some cheery things toward the end. But the upshot is a disturbing profile of topical informational flows contaminated with promotional content, contaminated with falsehoods, all of which deepens the problem of trustworthiness, which is the most nettlesome problem the news media face. The other problem I just add parenthetically is that the better news media, I fear, are kind of rising to the bait of a kind of reflexive adversarialism toward Trump. And I don't suspect there's a lot of love for Trump in this room, but I'm worried about what my students are leaving, what habits of mind and what propensity to do battle they're leaving with. And I don't think the media benefit in the long term from being goaded into a kind of combativeness where they are predisposed to try to find the very, very worst things they can say about government and look for those things. I fear for the even-handedness and the fair-mindedness that has to be part of journalism, to distinguish journalism as a profession and to give it real and enduring value in society. And I think it also invites further mistrust. So this is all my attempt here to contextualize so-called fake news. It resides within this informational system that has tremendous importance to the functioning of our political culture, fundamental to popular sovereignty, but it's a system that has huge deficiencies of its own. So traditional news has entered the digital age with no shortage of problems, and with how adequately, how honestly it actually serves the public. Now, my third area of interest here is that things are kind of getting worse. We have this system whose economics are built on ever more thoroughgoing dissembling and artifice. And I'm not talking just about phishing and deceptive solicitations. I'm saying more fundamentally that a huge proportion of internet traffic is not what it purports to be. The dominant economic underpinnings of the ad-supported digital world are based on surveillance and behavior monitoring, which is intended to guide and nourish speculation as to how susceptible you are to ad messages and what you're likely to do once you get them. So, in effect, the microeconomics of the internet, do you think this is doing it itself? Yes. I think you're right. Oh, there we go. Okay. The internet functions basically as an informational transaction. You give them information, they give you information. You didn't know you were giving them information, but that's what you're doing. And they're paying you for that information with the information you're downloading and reading. Content is the lure, it's the bait, it's the payment. And the uses of the information you're giving up are not well disclosed. So if you want to talk about fakery, let's start there. With a transaction, an economic transaction that you're not fully apprised of and you haven't really consented to. Now, to make things clearer, let's look at the hottest thing in the media business, which is not fake news at all. It's called native advertising. Term that you're familiar with? Yes, no? Hands up if you know about it. Oh, okay, so kind of a modest. Native ads, they used to be called advertorials in the print era. Now they're called sponsored content or news from our partners, anything except advertising. It's advertising supplied content that's camouflaged to look like editorial. It looks like it's produced by the editorial staff. It creates the rest of the publication. Here we go. Now you have that little Aetna brand publisher there. Well, BuzzFeed is a kind of sleazy site anyway, but this is a story that you would read and say, mindfulness, oh, I'm down with mindfulness. Well, it's coming from Aetna. I don't know why Aetna's doing this. I guess it affects their premium rates. I'm not sure. But in any event, this was not the product of BuzzFeed's editorial people. Now, the problem with the internet is that the effectiveness of pop-up display advertising continues to decline. So they are desperately, the advertising business is desperately looking for alternatives to that, and they have decided that native advertising is the way to go. Now, understand it's fundamentally fraudulent. Right? This is a fraud. It rests on the hope that people will overlook whatever limp and opaque disclosures the ad contains and accept the content as having much the same credibility and integrity as the surrounding material. We see this. Here we go. Famous story from 2005, I believe. The Church of Scientology had placed this story praising David Miscavige as the head of the church and the Atlantic, using the same typography, the same fonts, everything, and there's that word sponsor content. So Atlantic, this is the publication founded by Emerson and Longfellow, succumbs. And then we have another instance here from BuzzFeed. And then we have my favorite, which was the New Yorker magazine. Again, this is the high church, right? New Yorker magazine allowed Target, the store chain, the retail chain, to basically, too bad the colors are all washed out. There was no advertising in the issue of the New Yorker. You familiar with it? You know this story? Yeah. This is 2000, I think 2000 and something, 2009. No advertising. Target paid to put its logo, that little Target, to be the motif, the visual motif of the entire issue. Right? No advertising, no mention of Target. And it must, I don't know what it cost. They never did disclose how much it cost. A lot of money, right? But they basically hired the visual look and feel of the New Yorker. They put their look and feel to take over as the visual motif of the entire publication. Even the cover, the beach balls on the cover. Now, so the objective of this is to benefit from the brand equity and borrow the prestige and credibility of the editorial environment by disarming whatever reader resistance there might be to persuasive messaging. Now, these examples reside on websites, but the real potential of native advertising is on an individual consumer basis. When you click on a story, you can be served ad content that furthers a highly personalized, in a highly personalized market-based way. It splinters the public into individualized informational universes built around behavior-based inferences as to interest and receptivity. So it's not just content, it's the precision of the targeting that matters. People are selected for messaging based on their susceptibility to influence. So again, native advertising, just as the calibrated journalism we talked about a moment ago, reduces the common informational menu available to the general public. And it may also trick the search engines into linking to the native advertising content as if it was real editorial. So anyway, as we talk about news, about this phenomenon we're calling fake news, we have to acknowledge this larger universe of dissembling that digital technology has enabled, and which news, no matter how honestly gathered and presented, serves. Sometimes it occurs to me the real original sin of the media is advertising, is disengaging content from payment. In other words, the freeness of the news in the digital age permits you to be linking on and clicking on to things that don't have any particular value in and of themselves because you don't pay for it. If you did pay for it, I mean, I don't think I would be checking out what the stars of the 80s look like now, which I do. Well, I'm curious, right? But if I paid, probably not. All right, so what can be done? I said earlier that responses were needed from platforms, producers, professionals. So let's talk about what the platform response, by platforms we're talking about Google, Facebook, and the like. So I want to talk about the platform's responses, what we can do to put pressure on advertisers, and the strength of branding. First, on the platform level, here I'm talking about Google and then these other aggregation sites were the principal places nowadays where people encounter news content. Most younger people now, the older folks out here, here to tell you, most younger people now find the news via Facebook and other social media sites when it's recommended to them by people they trust. They're not going directly to the websites. They don't go to the New York Times site. That kind of side, they use Facebook and the like as side doors into it. So the cooperation of these platforms is indispensable to enabling bogus news to flourish because they have driven traffic to the content creators and universalized the profitability of fraudulent content. Consider this comment from Evgeny Morozov in The Guardian. It says it all. The problem is in fake news, the speed and ease of its dissemination. Those bloggers in Macedonia who decided to come up with stories about Hillary Clinton made money. They made money thanks to the fact that Google linked to their site and drove traffic to the site. So we have a bumper crop of fabrication because it pays. So the system rewards falsity and calumny. The question is what's to be done? Now, Facebook says it has launched an aggressive response in collaboration with legacy media. Google says it will take steps to keep its ads off pages that misrepresent, misstate, or conceal. We'll see. What's clear is that these platforms have the capacity to identify fraudulent sites. They can starve the sites of traffic if they choose to. They're under legal obligations, for example, not to allow child porn to draw traffic. They could do the same thing with sites that are seen, that are identifiable as fraudulent. And they could be shamed into doing that, and probably are. Then advertisers. The same token, online advertisers whose ads pop up on fraudulent sites need to be warned and punished by consumers if they fail to pull their ads. The same powerful mechanisms of social media that are driving traffic to fraudulent sites could be used to mobilize responses to that and to force advertisers to pull their support. Then there's branding. One of the things about we've traditionally relied on brands to tell us Which sites are trustworthy? Which sites we can rely on? And the problem now is that we say, well, where did you read that? I saw it on Facebook. Or I saw it online. That's my favorite. I saw it online. And there's not the same awareness of the possibility that the source that you're really going to is a source of dubious legitimacy. So how do you go about signaling quality standards in an environment where branding has been suppressed? And you can't rely on Medium either. Once upon a time, you knew if the news came on the broadsheet newspaper that landed on your front porch, that had a certain credibility, more so than the brochure you were handed or pamphlet you were handed on the corner. But you can't rely on that anymore. But how to let people know? Now, this is an open question, but there are people who are now working on solutions to that by finding ways to label sites or originating sites for content that are deserving of some measure of respect. And there are ways you could easily formulate a dozen different criteria. Do you hire reporters? Do you run corrections? Do you adhere to certain standards of confirmability before you run things? There are ways in which you could sort out the originating sites that are worth your respect and distinguish them from the ones that don't. But there's got to be some signaling mechanism that would enable aggregators to foreground the brands of sites and label them in ways that you and I can figure out whether they deserve our attention. And there'd be some way to include disclosure statements that indicate what news gathering practices and editorial standards certain sites exercise. You've got to do something to signal credibility in a way that brands used to do in fairly reliable ways. We have no alternative, we have no replacement for branding now. There's a group out of Santa Clara University up in San Jose called the Trust Project that's working on just this. And it's a good idea. Then there's the legacy news media. The legacy news media need to clean up their act. I don't know about you, but I don't read Donald Trump's tweets. I don't have to because the New York Times tells me about them. What's with that? These trusted news brands have fallen into the practice of legitimating and weaponizing information of dubious veracity from unrecognized sources. Why do they do that? They do that because they don't want to be out of touch. They want to be in the know. They want to be part of the conversation. You have Politico, which wants to own the morning. It's the political news website in D.C. So the reason the president has the ability to intimidate his opponents and to rivet attention on his utterances, which have no more thought, no more deliberation, no more intelligence behind them than doodlings on a pad during a cabinet meeting, the reason he's able to draw attention to that is because of the amplifying effect that legacy media are providing him with. Well, cut it out. And then there's the problem of money. Journalism organizations are cheaping out on news gathering costs. They're hiring people to do third-hand repurposing of somebody else's lazy reporting. It's because the industry we identify as a news business has been starved of money by the platforms that are making imperial fortunes from content they do nothing to create. It's probably the preeminent problem of industrial concentration in the world right now, is the amount of money and the amount of informational control wielded by the majors in the technology industry. We're talking Google, Facebook, Microsoft, who am I leaving out? Amazon, right. It's impossible to look at the hollowing out of the news business without recognizing the massive transfers of revenue from content creators to their distributors. And if antitrust laws are inadequate to address this, we need to elect legislators who will give us new ones. So, on to the problem of informational authority, how to reaffirm and reward the authority of facts. Well, listen, we need to recognize we're not stuffing the feathers back into the pillow. All of that wondrous empowerment I talked about at the beginning of this talk, all of the capacity to reach vast audiences with your handheld, your ability to get informed in ways that was unthinkable a generation ago. That's all here to stay. And I guess these expressive freedoms have been universalized in a way that it could indeed be utopian. They won't change, and they probably shouldn't. And let me just remind you that among the people most condemning fake news are some of the most authoritarian governments on earth. And they're criticizing their opponents using the same language of deploring fake news that we're hearing here. So you've got to be careful what you wish for, because they can brand things as false, and that's not the reason they're opposing it. So, but I guess my answer to this is a little bit self-serving. We went out of sequence. There we are. Apologize. It has to do with the need for professionalism in journalism. To me, it's greater than ever. I think restore the sense of public purpose that has little to do with following trend lines derived from social media and a lot to do with the foundational wish of journalism to enlighten the public through intellect, energy, and moral courage. It's about calling the powerful to account, betting on the emancipatory power of an enlightened citizenry, believing that truth, however elusive, is worth pursuing and sharing in honest and compelling ways. There are people who need help in finding their voice. There are people whose reputation before the larger community has been systematically defiled. There are civic goods that only the press can advance. So we've got new obstacles to contend with, but the struggle remains the same, and social betterment isn't something that you need to apologize for seeking. So we'll leave it at that, and I welcome questions from you all. Thank you. Yes, please. Questions? Yes.
Isn't one of the major problems with journalism now that corporations, there is no competition? It used to be in the major cities, there were 2 or 3 papers covering the city. Now you're lucky if there's one newspaper. Big media owns all the newspapers. Amazon owns the Washington Post. There is no competition for Facebook. There is no competition for Google. And when you don't have checks and balances, you're never going to really have truthful journalism.
So the question had to do with the collapse of competition in the news business. It's difficult to look at the absence of competition without asking why the field has drawn so little investor interest, why there are not, what has happened to the general population of news producers. And it's an enormous problem, but it's symptomatic of, I think, the pauperization of the news business as its advertising base basically was taken over by somebody else. The classified advertising, display advertising, public notice advertising, all of it has gone to the internet without any way to repay or without any way to cut in the legacy publications. It's worse than what you described in terms of the absence of competition. The remaining legacy publications are not only not competing, they're partnering with each other. So you'll find that, and we have yet to begun to harvest the result of that in state and local corruption, because nobody's covering state and local government anymore. And where you used to have 12 reporters covering the legislature in the state I spent a lot of time, which is Florida, you now have 2 or 3, and they're partnering on stories rather than competing to try to beat each other's brains out by advancing stories at the other's expense. That entire tradition of competition has been seriously, basically disappeared. So I take the point. I don't have an answer, except there's more activity in the journalism business than many of you may realize. There are a lot of philanthropically funded, foundation-funded startups that are doing very, very high-quality investigative reporting work. The problem is that that work is not reaching very large audiences, and it can be easily ignored. Yes.
David Rockefeller was quoted in 1991 as thanking the Washington Post, New York Times, and other publications for the discretion on promising to keep things private. So I would think that
David Rockefeller was thanking newspapers for their discretion in doing what?
for their discretion and attended our meetings and respected our promises of discretion for almost 40 years. And I've heard that quoted many times before. Is that considered fake news, or was he actually quoted as saying those things to say thank you for keeping our plans for world order private and confidential?
Rockefeller saying they had plans for world order.
They said, it would have been impossible for us to develop our plans for the world if we had been subjected to the lights of publicity during these years.
I see.
The world is more sophisticated and prepared to march forward in world government. So, and that was just a quote, so I'm just asking, and I heard that.
Do you think he said that?
No, that's what he's quoting.
No, I get it, but do you think he said that? They had a
That's
Rockefeller.
what I'm asking, is that considered, it was in a, and that's what I'm saying, is that the kind of stuff?
Well, it sounds a little loop. I mean, is it fake news? It sounds a little loopy to me. I can't.
Absolutely, so that's, and those are all publications that are considered highly respected.
Yeah, but they're not the origin of the quote.
Yeah, but that's what people are hearing, so maybe that's where a lot of people's, issues with newspapers not being complete.
Look,
That's what I'm asking.
okay, I think I understand the question. You can look at the criticism that goes under the banner of fake news as consistent with what's been called the paranoid tradition in American political culture, that there are people who are deeply suspicious of backroom deals and conspiracies involving vast numbers of shadowy figures, and they're doing all kinds of things. This David Rockefeller thing, like we got these plans for world government, but don't tell anybody, sounds a little bit along the lines of, really? I doubt it. And for him to come out and say, well, now I can be told, now we're ready to take over, come cue the black helicopters, I don't think so. So, yeah, I guess your question is that fake news? Something. It sounds like a paranoid fantasy. Yes, question.
How does the U.S. walk the line between ensuring quality, truthful journalism and policing the language of their journalists, like in the authoritarian?
Interesting question. How do you draw the line between intervening or regulating or encouraging the rebirth of journalism and interfering with an area that has always been staked off by the First Amendment as being something that you don't want the government taking any role in? I mean, it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem because normally we have a collective problem in this country. The disappearance of the news business is a tremendous civic blight. It keeps a lot of things that are good and meritorious from happening. There are conversations that are not happening because there's no place for those conversations to take place. There's reporting of realities that are not being unearthed because there's nobody doing the unearthing. It's a huge collective problem. You would like to think, if I took a poll here, would you, citizens of Bakersfield, how much money would you like to give every year to create an entity whose job it would be to keep the city honest? Right? Well, just suppose, let's just play a mental exercise here. And you say, well, I don't have that much money, I'll give you $50, and you have a bunch of money, maybe you give them $5,000. There's some number you could come to that would say, yeah, it's worth it to me to have a really strong entity that gives voice to the voiceless, that controls for corruption in government, that blows the whistle, all the things that I would tell my students you should be doing as journalists. All of those things are a civic function of immense, immeasurable value. Now, so it's worth something to you. You have a checkoff box in your tax returns. You could imagine a circumstance under which you pool those resources. But we don't do, and you'd say, okay, you have a printing press or you have an online site and you got 10 people here who graduated from college and they know how to write well and they're really smart and they're principled and they're honest. Let's have those people do it using the money we pooled from you guys, right? And you'll do it again next year. Now, you'd say, that sounds okay, but we can't do that because there's this belief that the First Amendment, which actually, if you read the First Amendment, it says you can't pass laws restricting the press. It doesn't say you can't pass laws encouraging the press, but we regard that kind of encouragement as as unconstitutional. But it prevents us from doing the logical thing. When you have a public need, you pool public resources and you deal with the need. We can't do that when it comes to the media because it's thought to be incompatible with our traditions of government hands-off when it comes to speech. And it's a problem. It's a problem. So you end up with these backdoor ways. We have philanthropists who are giving money. They don't come at you with clean hands. Foundations don't come to you with clean hands. Foundations have purposes. They have things they want to serve. They have rules. They have goals. They have social needs. They're far worse than advertisers in that respect. Advertisers didn't care what you wrote as long as it wasn't about them or didn't say something good about their competitors. But foundations know exactly what they want. They want to advance coverage of healthcare. They want to advance benefits or environmental goods, or they've got things. So they come to you with particular needs and talk, and it really does amount to an infringement of editorial independence. Yep.
Good evening, Dr. Wasserman. I'm Christina Lopez. I'm a graduate of the Graduate School of Journalism, class of 2012.
Hey, go Bears.
Go Bears. In the age of fake news and journalism, how important is media literacy in this time and in the next generation of journalists? What do they have to be cautious of?
Well, thanks. The question is about how important is media literacy. This whole talk is premised on trying to get people to understand they better understand the media better. And I think that media literacy is a tremendous, it's never been very well developed or very sophisticated among the American population. And it's indispensable now to understand exactly what's going on. And it's complicated. So, I mean, we've started now at Cal, we introduced, this wasn't there when you were there, we started doing undergraduate education, undergraduate minor in journalism for people who don't want to be journalists but want to understand what journalists do and want to be able to do it. Because whether they're doctors in a hospital working on the hospital website or they're lawyers and have social media outreach, everybody wants to have those communicative skills. So we're going to people, whether they're going to be bench scientists, we don't care. And we're trying to teach them how to be journalists, to understand how the media work and understand how they too can be producers of media, not just consumers of media, because that's our future. But thanks for that question. Yes, sir.
The traditional defense against personal untruths that have been promulgated is usually to establish libel suits. But if you look at politicians, it's extremely rare for politicians to use that defense. Do you know why they don't, and what defenses do they have in order to prevent mistruth?
So the question is about libel suits, particularly with respect to public officials. The reason it's not used is because it's extremely difficult to win a libel suit because of a 1964 Supreme Court ruling called Times versus Sullivan, which essentially says that if you're a public figure, in order to prove defamation, you've got to essentially show that the lie was deliberate. It was somebody deliberately lied about you, or either knew what they were printing was false, or was so reckless in the way they gathered, the way they put the information together, they might just as well have been meaning to slime you. And that's an extremely difficult standard to meet. So as a consequence, public officials rarely file, and they even more rarely win libel suits. And the last time there were public officials who I tried was in the 70s when William Westmoreland, the former commander of the American troops in Vietnam, and Ariel Sharon, who was former prime minister of Israel, both had libel suits at the same time, and neither one of them won. It's very, very difficult. And to some degree, it's meant to preserve a broad space within which aggressive reporting can take place. But is it fair to public officials? I don't think so. But that's why defamation suits are used so rarely. And even in instances when people are not public figures, Richard Jewell, doesn't they mean anything to anybody here? Richard Jewell, what was it, 1996, Atlanta Olympics, the explosion in the park. Richard Jewell is a security guard. he blew the whistle beforehand, saved a lot of lives, but he came under suspicion as being the bomber. And he got completely slimed by the press. And he eventually, he was innocent as the driven snow, but the press went after him. He was a person of interest. They reported these stories about how he lived with his mother. He'd always wanted to be a policeman, but he failed the entrance exam. He was this kind of frustrated loner, the usual pathology, the usual profile of pathology that you associate with somebody who does something as horrible as planning a bomb, right? He's innocent. Some white supremacist lunatic was eventually branded with it. But in any event, he sued for libel because he was slimed. And they claimed, among other things, he was a public official, a public figure. He was a public figure because his publicness consisted of his answering the phone when reporters called. Sir.
Your best applause line of the night, I think, was when you said, when you criticized legacy media for covering the president's tweets.
Right.
Well, why not? I mean, this is the president of the United States in his bathrobe, and he's, he's calling out Barack Obama for having,
Yeah, good question. What do you do?
We're hitting Hillary Clinton with a golf ball. I mean, that speaks to his maturity. That speaks to so many things.
Question is, what do you do when the president is tweeting all these crazy things? You ignore it? I don't have a good answer. What I would do, I would have something called Trump Watch on the front page. And every idiotic thing he did since the last news cycle, I'd have on there. But I'd relegate it and try to rob it of the power that it has when it becomes the basis of a story. And everybody then has to respond to it. Oh, what does he mean? What's that going to do? What do you think? And this is having effects on the way the government is running because people are scared to death of being criticized like that to his millions of followers. So I'm not sure. It's an unprecedented problem, but I think I would relegate it to a kind of curiosity because that's kind of what it is. Sir.
Okay, so you spoke about Google and the echo chamber that it tends to create for its users, and the same for Facebook. Do you think it's the responsibility of consumers to hold Google responsible for the echo chamber it creates, or perhaps to go to Google's competitors, which don't use tracking and don't, some of which don't create that ideological echo chamber? Do you understand?
I do understand. I wish I had a good answer for you. The question was, what do we do about, really, what is our response as consumers? What is our response to Google? What's likely to have the greatest effect? I think that Google is susceptible to public pressure. I think they are mindful that they are vulnerable because they're so big. And there's so many people that would rejoice if pieces of that were just torn off and made to stand alone. Because they're not just worried about retaining what they have, their plans are aggressive enough to engulf many other markets. It's like watching Amazon, which now has Whole Foods. They want to get into bricks and mortar retailing. What? I thought their whole thing was delivery. Why does Google want self-driving cars? What's that got to do with search? What? Because they want your undivided attention, maybe. I think it's impossible to overstate the resources and the vision of the people running that. So they are susceptible to pressure. And I think we need to understand that bringing them to heel is something we both have the power to do and we have an obligation to do it. So I don't know how. I'm not a political rabble-rouser. But I'm saying is they are vulnerable, and I think there are people that would be willing. There are clearly identifiable areas that should probably not remain under the Google umbrella. So this idea that they can endlessly expand using their unrivaled treasury to take over and basically subjugate even more markets is something that needs to be fought. So that's I just don't think we need to accept and to be resigned to this. Yes, ma'am.
How can professionalism and journalism be revived without stomping on the First Amendment? Like, how does that standard of news be set without telling people you can't publish this?
Well, it can't, and we're not going to get into restricting speech by forbidding it. And the question is, how do we pull back, and how do we rob it of some of the oxygen it now gets, it now pulls out, using basically nefarious and misleading and deceptive means? So I think the answer is, if you, look, I would like to see the internet put on a paying basis. If I had my druthers, I'm a sort of a market fundamentalist, and I think people should pay for what they download with cash, not with identifying personal information. But I think the more we are able to expose and to make transparent the information that we're getting, and able to identify the information that's credible and worth trusting, the better we are likely, the more likely we are to be able to confine and restrict the size of their audiences in a way that will deny them revenues. So I'm in favor of a stronger signaling device. That's why I was talking about brands, a stronger way to identify the kind of news that warrants belief and is authoritative. And I think that's the direction we need to go in. Right now, it's a free fire zone out there. And it's extremely difficult to identify because of the suppression of branding, among other things. Yes, sir. Oh, man, I'm sorry.
So in my summer class for Poli-Sci 101, I learned that if false or biased info is provided, if misleading interpretations of the political world or none at all are offered, people cannot form opinions in accordance with their values, and interest and popular sovereignty cannot be said to exist. And the Pew researcher in a 2004 study found that news people, especially national journalists, are more liberal and far less conservative than the general public, and most national and local journalists, as well as a plurality of Americans, are moderate. And the Econ Journal Watch, they did a study at 40 leading universities in the U.S., and they found that a ratio of 12 to 1 professors were Democratic to Republican, and the least friendly department was the history department with a ratio of 33.5 to 1. So,
Which department?
history.
History.
That's according to the Econ Journal Watch.
Right.
So, seeing as popular sovereignty is part of what makes democracy, do you think academia and whatever background views that professors have are contributing to a lot of the media biases? Because I also learned in my communication class last semester that the way professors teach is affected by what they believe.
Wow. Wow, that's a great question. So the question, I don't want to, that was a long, learned question, and I don't want to not fail to do it justice, but the question is, you set forth the truth, the reality, which that survey results indicate that journalists tilt left, that university professors tilt left, and they're out, to some degree, they're kind of out of touch with the political, if you like, mainstream of America. This rests on a lot of factual, a lot of evidence, a lot of things not in evidence. I mean, there have been surveys done of the press, for example. They've tended to be the East Coast national press rather than the entirety of the journalism world, which, when you have small town papers, they kind of are all over the place, or small town local news. There's some evidence, there's some suggestion that the actual evidence, the actual empirical base is limited. But let's concede the point that journalism attracts people who are basically reformers and basically want to, they're not going into banks for a reason, they're going into journalism, they want to blow the whistle, they want to make a difference, they believe in civic betterment, all this stuff I was talking about. And let's also agree that academics, certain academics, I mean, economics departments kind of tilt right. In my experience, political science, maybe centrist, sociology, never mind. So there are English, I don't know, they don't know, philosophy. So it's a little bit all over the place. But I take your point. Why, now, but the question, I think the really important question is this a problem? Is this a problem? And I think, yes, it is a problem. It is a problem because there's a lot of unexamined assumptions that go into reporting. There's a lot of stuff that are coming in. I've seen this with my students. Look, it's Berkeley. You know, Berkeley is not exactly a place that goes out of its way, you know, to get strong conservative presence, and you feel that. So you're not. So there are arguments that we should be having that we don't have because there's nobody to argue the other side. You know, I'm being totally straight with you. But it is a problem because there are. Look, journalism finds problems. If they're doing their job right, they're unearthing problems. What is the normal response when you find a problem? Somebody needs to do something. Who's going to do something? The government, right? Sometimes it yields, you know, people should lend a hand. Sometimes there's a voluntaristic response. I get that. But for the most part, we need a new program, we need a new law. And the conservatives would say, correctly, that is the liberal response. But it's also hardwired into what journalists do. Somebody do something. Well, who is there? Who is that somebody? So it is a problem. It's probably a problem in academics, maybe not so much, but I don't, you know, care about that as much as I care about journalism. And it would be wonderful to have more strong conservatives in journalism. I think we'd end up with better journalism. We'd end up with a more thoughtful, fresher eye on some of the problems that we're looking at. So, yeah, I take the point. Sir.
I want to draw your attention to this gentleman right here who was holding his hand.
Oh, sorry.
I forgot. Well, my question is with 7 out of 10 voters in the local community, if TVC institutes a Trump watch, they'll be accused of beating up on the president. In other words, if our local media institutes a Trump watch, they will lose 70% of their remaining subscribers. What does the media do when faced with the truth or bankruptcy?
Obviously, you can't serve your public if you're out of business, right? And the media have to be in a conversation with their public as to worldview and about the things the public cares about and wants to see reported. Ignoring that is foolish. So I understand your point. I was responding, and I'm asking the question, how do you cover this non-traditional behavior? How do you cover this ill-disciplined, ill-considered, and potentially consequential behavior by your chief executive, somebody you're used to giving by dint of culture, by dint of tradition, you're used to giving rapt attention to? How do you do it when that attention is actually ill-serving the public? How do you balance your obligation to keep an eye on him with your obligation to try to maintain a news agenda that fairly reflects the entirety of challenges that the society faces? And it's not a good, I hear it's not a good solution. If you had a Trump watch, why? Little snippets of what the president did today? You don't have to put a cartoon and make him look like a buffoon. You can do it in a way that gives people an update on what he's up to without conferring unusual stature and importance to these things. And I'm suggesting that's one solution. I'm not running a newspaper anymore, but that's one way you could do it. I hear, news people are not in the business of pleasing their audiences, but nor are they in the business of driving them away in anger. And those are the realities you need to reconcile and negotiate. I would say that talking to your audience, talking to your consumers, talking to your public is a good way to start. And I think it would be interesting if I was running a paper where I felt that my community and I were really moving in very different directions politically, I would have a town meeting. I would want to hear what they want us to do. And I would explain to them why we felt that we couldn't do that and still remain professional and dedicated to our professional responsibilities. Just one other point. Going back to your question, my friend over here, I think you need to be very careful about generalizing on what's believed to be the political opinion of Americans. And you need to look very carefully at the results of the gerrymandered political system when you look at this dominance of the three branches of government, dominance of the state houses, and relate that to the actual voting behavior of people. And you're going to find that there's a grotesquely disproportionate representation of a minority party in positions of power. That doesn't really reflect the mainstream of America, which is far more centrist than we might think. Anyway, your question.
So in Philip Meyer's book, The Vanishing Newspaper, he basically discusses that in probably like the next 20 to 30 years, newspapers are going to become obsolete because of all the digital news that's out there. And I'm wondering, when you have, like you were saying, when you have all these news outlets with Facebook, Amazon, Instagram, Twitter, all these things that are putting out these ideas, and you still have these reputable newspapers like the New York Times, Washington Post, but even there, like you said, kind of almost hurting their professionalism by, reporting about the president's tweets, I guess what I'm saying is how do newspapers nowadays and in the future, how do you see them competing with sort of social media and, this idea of citizen journalism, people putting their ideas out there? I mean, is social media hurting newspapers so much that, they are vanishing, or do newspapers need to use this social media as platforms, but is that going to hurt their professionalism? I mean, how do you intertwine and sort of also separate these two news outlets?
Did everybody hear the question? How do you reconcile the kind of new approach to reporting and that the social media represent? How do you reconcile that with the kind of traditional standards of reporting and that you associate with newspapers? And I think that I think that the traditions of news gathering are very much in decline. I think that it's going to take a concerted effort to retain the kind of responsibility and the kind of thoroughness and the basically core bedrock values that journalism has defined itself around. Because I think that the standards associated with social media are on the ascendant and they're much easier to comply with. So I think what you're seeing now is legacy news organizations are gradually collapsing in they're succumbing to the temptation to be an alternative or to be a true competitor of social media. You see that I'll give you an example. You have a New York Times reporter who's on the air talking to somebody on CNN or MSNBC, right? Now, New York Times, when you write something for the New York Times, a lot of people get their hands on it. And they look very carefully. And every adjective and every verb and every noun and every element of that story is scrutinized. And it's a very careful news organization. Then you take the writer and you put him on the air. And you say, well, what does this all mean? And he is right at that moment expected to deliver and express himself in ways that are wholly incompatible with what he would do in print. The different world. Forward-looking statements, interpretive statements, all kinds of liberties he's expected to exercise as part of the lingua franca of being on TV that would be forbidden. He'd be fired if he put it into his stories. What's going on there? Well, the power of the medium, the vernacular of the medium, the grammar of that medium is different. And what's happening now is you're seeing news organizations, in order to be competitive, they want to stake their flag online. That's why they want to get the story out there first. Because when you're a local newspaper, you want people coming to you first. If a small plane crashes or there's a big tie-up in the intersection, you want people to go right to your local news site. What happened? You expect to know that. So the legacy news organizations wanted to retain, to transfer that centrality to the civic life of the community online. But to do that, they had to adhere to different rules. Less thoroughness, less confirmation, get it out there first, fix it later when you get better information, the self-cleaning internet. So I'm not very hopeful. I mean, what you're going to see is transformation. And the hope is that you can retain the values that matter the most in journalism. This fair-mindedness, independence, thoroughness, respect for facts, these sort of things, and some notion of public significance. These are the kind of bedrock, cornerstone values of journalism. I hope that some of that will not only be retained, but maybe can be propagated. Maybe those professional standards, you can see news organizations, internet native news organizations can begin to accept that as something that confers prestige on them, that gives them more readers, gives them more credibility. So I'm hopeful that we'll have kind of a cross-contagion, if you like, between legacy and online worlds. And some of the professionalism of the legacy media can be moved into online worlds so that they begin to get things right and begin to feel better about what their social function is. So I'm a little bit of an optimist. Sir?
A couple of questions back, you made a prayer for good conservative journalism. But I noticed on the slide that you presented branding national news media that you left out Fox News.
Yeah.
Are you making a statement about Fox News?
No, I wasn't. I pulled that down. I pulled that down from the internet, and that's the way it came. So it wasn't an attempt to exclude Fox News.
Would you like to make a statement of Fox News?
Look, I mean, the question is about Fox News. Fox News has successfully created a different form of topical programming. And it has, by replacing news with personality, it is, it has become the standard bearer that everybody else is trying to meet. CNN's gone, rushed after to try to do the same thing. MSNBC's tried to do the same thing from the left side of the spectrum. So Fox News was a kind of brilliant success. It also, unfortunately, is not very strong as a news organization. And it...
It's not your conservative journalist that you're looking for.
I'm not sure, I'm not sure it's journalism. I mean, it's kind of Rush Limbaugh. I don't think he's a journalist. He's a commentator. He's a voice. He's a presence. Yes, ma'am.
Is fake news prevalent around the whole world, or is it just in America?
Is fake news prevalent? Apparently, fake news is a worldwide phenomenon, yes. Big scandal in Brazil over it. There have been numerous, if you Google it online, you will find fake news is an international issue, and as I mentioned briefly, it's also been the target of reprisals by authoritarian governments who are trying to suppress internet expressive freedoms in the name of cracking down on fake news. Yes?
A lot of professions have a legal obligation to do their job professionally. If a doctor does malpractice, then he's legally held responsible. Would it be, if the journalist's field was held accountable legally for giving out false news, is that possible? Would that step on the First Amendment? Would that eliminate them? They could still do the First Amendment, but if they're being held legally responsible, wouldn't that make them hold to a higher standard?
The question is, can journalists be held legally responsible for falsity, for fake news? And the answer is, sort of. But we don't have criminal sanctions against falsehood. They're even in the process of getting rid of restrictions on falsity in commercial speech, advertising and the like. So the short answer, I know, well they are, because companies are, the cigarette makers don't want to be forced to run pictures of diseased lungs on their packets. So they're claiming this is against the First Amendment because it's compelled speech, right? So the whole huge counterattack against where companies are using the First Amendment, as they did with Citizens United, to make political points. But the short answer is, the First Amendment does not permit criminal sanctions for falsity. So the only, under our system of laws, as I understand it, probably some lawyers in the room will correct me, you can only sue if you're harmed. you can sue as a civil for damages.
But, so like a therapist is held accountable if she doesn't report certain danger to a person, but a journalist can cause chaos throughout the whole country.
Right.
And they can just, that's totally fine.
It's not fine. It's terrible.
It's not fine.
It's atrocious. But
there should be something done so that, I mean, they're held accountable. And then,
you know, we have journalism is a profession embedded in a business, and the market determines that. And the belief is that the market will punish them by depriving them of audiences, depriving them of advertising.
but the educated people will punish them. But the
Right.
uneducated,
I'm not saying it's a satisfactory answer, but it's the only one we've got. We done? One more? Yes.
Do you have any advice for any current journalism students or recent graduates? Should we be heading straight to grad school, get this work experience first?
Look, in many respects, this is as interesting a time as there's ever been to go into journalism. Right now, we're sort of experiencing a Trump bump, and audiences are up, ratings are up, everybody's more interested in civic affairs than ever. But I would just say there's more experimentation, there's more innovation going on in journalism now than there ever was in my career. There's more opportunity for people to know how to make good film. Once upon a time, if you were a filmmaker, you could go to Frontline on PBS, and that was about it, right? And then cable came, so you had A&E, you had Discovery, you had a few other, but now they're going crazy between Netflix and Amazon and Vice and HBO, and it's a tremendous time. The audience, the channel capacity, the channels need to be fed. They're voracious for content. And this is a terrific time and there are more nonprofit groups that are rising, philanthropically funded. They're doing investigative reporting like ProPublica, like Cal Matters in Sacramento, Texas Tribune. There's a lot going on in journalism now. It's just not as stable as it was. You can't just expect to find a job and go from a weekly to a small weekly to a small daily to a bigger daily, and on up to destination. The stability and the confidence of an orderly career path is gone. But if you're nimble and you're entrepreneurial, this is an amazing time to go into journalism. And God knows the stories are out there to be told. Thank you.